So I'm going to go ahead and get us started for the day. We're in chapter 32 of Genesis for today. So we've jumped a couple chapters. As we've talked about this summer, the lectionary bounces around. Very rarely does it follow in line with the narrative, chapter after chapter. And so our text today has jumped about 3 chapters. If you remember last time, I believe we were in chapter 29. With Jacob meeting Rachel, and so in that in between time, there has been mainly a contention between Jacob and Laban, his father-in-law, and so Jacob has essentially prospered, and Laban kind of gets mad. There's this trickery that happens between the two of them around livestock. And eventually Jacob's like, you know what, let's get out of here. And then Laban overtakes him. And so that's basically what's happened between last week's reading and this week's reading. I lift that up just to kind of catch you up in the story, but also to lift up, there's not really any mention whatsoever of Esau. And if you remember, that's essentially why Jacob has he's fled, I should say. He's fled his brother. So the text has kind of left that part of the story. But we come back in today's text, and that's a very central part of this story, is that tension between the two brothers, Jacob's exile, and now Jacob is returning home. And if you have your Bible with you right now, I want you to just turn to 31, chapter 31, and go to verse 13. And it is God speaking to Jacob, and he says, or I should say God says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and return to the land of your birth. So this is happening in the context of the conflict between Jacob and Laban, and yet there's a larger story because returning back to the place of his birth means he will at some point confront his brother. And so that's where we enter into today's text. He's leaving kind of behind the story of Laban and the conflict there. Remember that Walter Brueggemann said Jacob is a man of conflict. And so his conflict with Laban is done. And yet now we enter into the conflict with Esau. So I'm going to break this passage up into 2 readings. Aaron, would you read, I'm actually just going to read the first couple of verses, and then if you'll read verses 3 through 21. It's a long reading, but I trust you. And Nicole, could you read 22 through 32? Okay, great. So we're in chapter 32. And I will start us off. I just want to read these first couple of verses. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. So he called that place Mahanaim.
Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, this is what you are to say to my master Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, men servants and maid servants. Now I am sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in your eyes. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 groups. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. He spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau: 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, Go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds. He instructed the one in the lead, When my brother Esau meets you and asks, To whom do you belong, and where are you going, and who owns all these animals in front of you? Then you are to say, They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us. He also instructed the second, the third, and all the others who followed the herds, You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And be sure to say, Your servant Jacob is coming behind us. For he thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp.
The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, Let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. And he said to him, What is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked, Tell me, I pray, your name. But he said, Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, For I have seen God's face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh on the sinew of the hip.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's such a rich story, and there's so much to it. And so I kind of want to nerd out and tell you all the linguistic stuff, all the references back to earlier parts of the story, all the theological implications. But there's too much. I could literally teach this class for I don't know, 3 hours straight, and I'd still be talking. So I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to try to cram a lot in, so bear with me, because there's so much in this story. And it's one of these stories, Genesis is so self-referential, obviously because it's a singular kind of long narrative, but there's so much in the Jacob narrative that just keeps bouncing back and forth to itself. So I hope to kind of point some of that out. But we enter into the story, and boom, there's angels. We always think of the Bible as God's everywhere and ever present, but that's not the case. There are plenty of stories in Scripture where God is not referenced in the slightest, not explicitly or implicitly. And so it's important to notice when God is referenced, because when God is referenced, that's kind of a big sign there. And so what happens is, right from the get-go, we get angels, and these angels are kind of accompanying Jacob. And so that's sending a kind of signal back in Jacob's story, right, to chapter 28, when the angels are descending the ladder in his vision. And it's also kind of foreshadowing what we just read, that Jacob is going to wrestle with this mysterious figure, an angel. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, and it means messenger. And so you'll see in verse 1, it said Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. And then in verse 3, it says Jacob sent messengers before him. Same word, it's just messengers of God would be an angel in the way we think of it. and messenger, as used in verse 3, is just servants. And so that's an important thing to do. The text is connecting this, but distinguishing it. And I want you to think about that, because there's two things going on in this story. There's two meetings. Jacob is going to meet his brother, which is in the next chapter. But remember, these chapters were added later. This story is continuing into the 33rd chapter. So Jacob is meeting with Esau, and he meets with this stranger / God / angel / man. And so you're getting this kind of tension between the sacred and the profane. The sacred is the family story and all the tension he has with his brother Esau, and the sacred is this meeting he's having with God, essentially, or the messenger of God, or whoever this strange person is. And I want you to think about, why are these two stories told so close together? How are they related? How are they different? But at the same time, how you can't distinguish, especially in the story of Jacob, between the human, the messiness of life, and the sacred or the holy. They are intimately connected, and they cannot be separated. They can be distinguished, but they can't be kind of pulled apart. It's also important to note that this story as a whole is Jacob preparing to meet Esau, this strange encounter, and then meeting Esau. So it's kind of like a God sandwich, right? There's Esau as the loaves of bread, and the stranger or God is the meat in the middle. That's a technique Mark uses a lot. I forget, there's a big word that's used to talk about this, but Mark does that a lot. Mark will interrupt a story with another story in the middle of it. And that's what's going on here. And that's not to say that they're separate, but the text is essentially screaming to you, hey, pay attention. So Jacob sends messengers ahead to his brother, who he must confront on his way back home. Remember, his brother is a separate nation, essentially, in Ceia, and that's largely because he's married foreign women. There's a really neat play on words here with servant Jacob. So it says in verse 4, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob. If you remember, in all the way back to chapter 25, when Rachel, I think it's chapter 25, when Rachel is pregnant and she prays to God, what's going on, and trying to figure this out. And there's this oracle, right? You have two nations within you, and the younger, or the elder shall serve the younger. The elder shall serve the younger is essentially the elder becoming the servant and the younger becoming the Lord. And here Jacob reverses that as he's about to meet his brother. So the language is literally a reversal of the oracle. And that's important because we're seeing Jacob, who has been mischievous and deceitful and full of tricks, starting to become more direct in confronting his issues instead of trying to wiggle his way out. I mean, the chapter right before this, he was doing basically witchcraft to get livestock from Laban. It's the weirdest story. You can read it if you want, but he's tricking is what he's doing. And so here we see him stop tricking. There's something of a maturity about him. So they're preparing to meet Esau, and all of a sudden we find out that Esau has 400 men with him. And so Jacob, you can imagine, it has to be very scared. He's very wealthy, but he's largely just with family and a bunch of servants and animals. And so he prays. And if you listen to the words of the prayer, I want to read this. It starts at verse 9. Think about chapter 28 and the promise that Jacob makes at Bethel. Remember, he hoists up that big rock and he says, hey, God, if you protect me, I'll be your man. But it's only if you protect me. And now listen to this, because this is very similar to that. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant, for with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. And now I have become two companies, two camps. That's the exact same word that you see in verse 2 with Mahanaim. Mahanaim means camp, but there's an extra basically syllable added in it, or vowel. And that makes it two camps. So again, this self-referentialness. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mother with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. So there's the promise of protection, there's the covenantal promise, and yet Jacob is referring to it in the sense of, I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and faithfulness, instead of just a couple chapters back in 28 where he said, if you protect me, if you make my children abundant, then. And so this text happens so quick, it's not spread out like a novel like we're used to, but you have to kind of pick up on all these things the text is doing. The text is showing Jacob maturing here. I will not say he's fully matured by any means, but I will say there is a distinction between the Jacob we saw in 28 or even in chapter 31 with the Jacob we are meeting in this chapter. And so this is almost like a coming of age. There's a German term for genres that are like coming of age stories, is Bildungsroman. And that's essentially what this chapter is. So he prays. It's this very humble prayer. It's full of humility. And then he splits the camps up. And then there's this strange thing in verse 20. I don't think you get the clarity of this, but I want to read Walter Brueggemann's translation of this. So it says, this is what Jacob thinks. If you're looking in your Bible, it says, for he thought, and this is how Brueggemann translates it after for he thought. I may appease his face with the present that goes before me, and afterwards I will see his face. Perhaps he will lift my face. So the present passed before him. That word face and before is pen or penaim in Hebrew, and it's the same word, face and before. We talk about the word pneuma all the time, right? In the Greek, pneuma can mean wind, breath, and spirit. And if you look at John, I think it's John 3 with Nicodemus, it says wind, breath, spirit, and it just goes back and forth in the English translation, but in the Greek, it's just pneuma, pneuma, pneuma. And you see the same thing here. The translator is having to pick between these two words, and it's face or before. So it's either being used as a noun or a preposition. This is foreshadowing Jacob seeing God's face and naming that place Peniel or Penuel, which is using that word pen or Penaim. So the story of Jacob meeting Esau, again, is intimately connected with him meeting God or this angel. And they're connected. The text is showing us, the text is essentially blinking these red lights saying, pay attention. The Esau is connected to God. Not that they're the same person, but this story is similar and connected. So that's basically that part of this chapter. And now we break into the next chapter. And the next chapter is one of the most familiar stories in the kind of patriarchal stories, the stories of the patriarchs, the stories of the mothers and fathers of Israel. I don't know what to say about this story. It's so much stranger than we make it out to. It happens so quick. The text is disjointed. There is not any clarity around who this person is. But the text is doing this linguistic thing again, right? So Jacob is Yaakov in Hebrew. Jabbok, the stream that he crosses, the river, the stream is Yabak. And wrestle is Ye'ebek. I'm not pronouncing these correctly. I'm doing my best, but I'm not doing it well enough. But listen, so Jacob, Yaakov, Jabbok, Yabak, and wrestle Ye'ebek. So there's a similarity there that we're hearing again and again. This happens a lot in Genesis, but specifically throughout the Jacob narrative. So Jacob sends his family across the stream. He's by himself. We don't really get why. And then verse 24, one of the strangest verses in all of Genesis, it says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Where'd this guy come from? Did Jacob know him? Did he just appear? Is he an angel? Did he descend from heaven? We just have no clue. It's so strange, it's so sudden, and it's so mysterious. And if it doesn't feel that way, you need to read the story again and again with new eyes, because it is, and it's meant to be. It's meant to be sudden and strange. It's supposed to catch us off guard, right? It's a very domestic scene. He's traveling along. He's worried about his brother. And then all of a sudden, this stranger in the night appears. And again, remember, Jacob's dream was at night too. So the strange man is wrestling, and it's interesting, the Hebrew word here is not Adam, which is man, it's Ish, or Ish, and that means either man or either a divine being. So most of your text will translate it as man. Does anyone have anything besides man? No? If you do, just speak up and interrupt me. But it could easily be translated kind of as like a divine being, or a lowercase God, like God lowercase. And so they're wrestling, and the man that Jacob is wrestling with sees that Jacob is a worthy contender, and he's not gotten the upper hand on him. And so there's this weird scene where he strikes him on the hip, and Jacob's hip comes out of the socket. And the man says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." Again, what the heck does that mean, right? Why is he trying to escape at day? I think the text is pushing us to see this isn't a normal adversary. This is a adversary in the sense of holy, as other, as something kind of transcendent. And Jacob says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Again, this is a sign of Jacob maturing. Jacob is confronting his problems and not trying to wiggle his way out of it or find some kind of deceitfulness to do. Instead, he is simply holding on and saying, "You have to bless me." And so the man says, "What is your name?" And he says, "Jacob." And then in verse 28, the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." And so this is significant, again, not only for the name, which roughly means God strives or strives with God, but also that Jacob is getting a new name. Remember, Abraham used to be Abram, and Sarah used to be Sarai, Sarai. And so the name change indicates something. And it's also kind of playing in line with what I've been lifting up, that this is a coming of age story for Jacob. Jacob is taking on a new identity, and remember how important names were back then. And so Jacob becomes Israel. And we know what that means and the importance of that. And so Jacob then in turn says, "Let me know your name." And he says, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blesses him. So we don't get the name, but he blesses him. But then there's this cryptic verse in verse 30 where it says, "So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." Remember, Exodus, Isaiah, other parts of the Bible say, if you see the face of God, you will die. And so Jacob kind of indicates that tradition by saying, I have seen the face of God, and yet I have survived. The sun rises, Jacob limps off. He's marked by this. I always see this as a physical symbol of a spiritual struggle, because I don't think the text is saying that this person is an illusion. There is a very physical struggle going on, but I think the text is speaking as well to a deeper struggle as far as the identity of Jacob and who Jacob is as a person. And so you get this physical symbol to denote that to the larger crowd around Jacob. Think about I always think about Paul when he talks about the thorn in his side. And no one knows what that was exactly. Some people think it was a medical condition he had, but it's interesting to think of this as the suffering being a sign of something spiritual, right? And that's what I was trying to say too, with the Esau is very much a domestic issue, and the angel is very much a holy issue, and yet you cannot separate the two. And then we have to go to the cross, right? The cross is the most utmost awful, grotesque, horrible physical suffering that there could be. And yet as Christians, we believe there is a deeply, deeply spiritual message to it. And so I think what that leads us to, and I hope this is something that most of us would think, is you can't separate the spiritual from the material. They are deeply intertwined. The message of the gospel, the message of the kingdom, likewise, is not just a message of, you're going to spiritually be saved and go to heaven one day, but rather a deeply material message as well, that you are responsible for the care of your brother. And that leads me into this thing that Jacob must conflict both his brother Esau and his God in this wrestling. And what are the greatest commandments? You shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so the God, the spiritual, and the brother or the neighbor, the material are deeply intertwined and cannot be disconnected. And I think that is by and large a huge part of this story. The last thing I'll say quickly is there's this weird verse where at verse 32, therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. That's nowhere in scripture. There's no reference to that. It's just here. That's it. And so what most commentators say is happening here is the text is trying to make a connection between the ancient story of Jacob and the present day story of the readers of Jacob, right? So they're making a connection saying this story has an import to you, to Israel. This is also the first reference to Hebrews as Israelites. So the Hebrews are now becoming Israelites. And that's important for a lot of reasons, which we'll see throughout the rest of Scripture. But it's also important because Israelites essentially means sons of Israel or children of Israel. And so now you're seeing this change of Jacob from just a person to this larger figure that stands over the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the Hebrews. I want to show you a couple quick Can y'all see this? My screen? Let me So these are just a couple visual depictions of this. And I point them out because this is such a strange story. And it's interesting to see how people deal with the story. But I find one of the most interesting things is, without fail, every single one of these depicts it as an angel. I think so. So this is a famous engraving from 1855. You can see the wings, Jacob wrestling. This is a really cool picture just of the scale of the landscape. Oh, why isn't it? Oh, and then this is I believe a Jewish American. This is from 1936, and it's a very abstract. I love the color in this. And you can see the hands and the arms here, the eyes, nose. I think this is an eye too. I'm imagining this is the angel or God, and this is Jacob. And so it's abstract, but you still have some figurative representational elements to it. I've come to really appreciate this. I saw this, I think I first saw this like 5 or 6 years ago when I was actually teaching Genesis then. And I've always really liked this depiction. This is Gauguin, and this is, it's called After the Sermon, parenthetically, Jacob Wrestling with Angels. And so you see I believe Dutch women here. and they just heard the story and they're praying, and so it's happening in their imagination. And Gauguin said, in a kind of secular context, that's the only place that this ever happened. So he's trying to make a very secular thing here and say, well, this story only happens in the minds of people that read it. It never happened in real life, which is, I think, as people of faith, it's an interesting thing to think through, because I don't think that, I'm not saying the story didn't happen, but I'm saying that it happens in our minds reading it. To me, validates it in a way, because the story is being told thousands of years later. Anyhow, I love Gauguin, and I just wanted to share that one. And of course, Chagall, and you see here, again, there's wings, and Jacob looks like a little child almost, which is an interesting depiction. And this makes it look like it wasn't really a fair fight, right? It's like when a little kid runs at you and you just kind of put your hand on their head and they're going like this. I don't know. That's what I get from that one. This is a Japanese artist who borrowed from a very folk type of art. And I believe these were prints. So here you have the angel or God. Notice the sets of eyes, and Jacob. This is Delacroix. There's a really cool sketch that he did before this. There's a lot going on in this story. There's stuff happening down here. Obviously, this isn't what it would have looked like, more or less. They're very Anglo-European looking, but it's a neat depiction that I wanted to share. And then there's this, another kind of not abstract but abstracted one. This is from the 19th century. And then lastly, this is actually an icon, but it's from 2015. And I really like this one for a lot of reasons. You get the touching of the hip. It's still an angel, but I also see this this tiredness in Jacob, right? You see this just kind of worn outness, but there seems to be this sense that he's not letting go. And that just speaks volumes to me for a number of reasons. But one of the things I think is interesting, and that is, this is not a Jacob trying to find an out. This is a Jacob holding on, and yet it's not an easy thing for Jacob. There's also the rock that Jacob stands on. I don't know. I haven't read much on this icon, but I think that references back to 28, right? When he's sleeping on the rock that he eventually turns into the shrine at Bethel. It would have been a much bigger rock, obviously, but I don't know if that's just a reference or not. So I would advise you, there's a lot more. Those were just a couple that I found recently. And they give us a good view. And one of the things I think is most interesting is the depiction of this story is all of these artists have settled that this was an angel. And there's no sense for sure that the adversary is an angel. And so that's a really neat thing about interpretation, right? As we interpret stories, we add elements to the story that are not in the story. A couple of quick questions I have myself, and then I'll transition to y'all. What is this story teaching us about God? This is not the Jesus by the lake welcoming the little children. This is a mysterious God, a God that wrestles, a God that injures in a way. There's a quote by Brueggemann in his commentary. He says, God will not be taken lightly, and there are no cheap reconciliations. And so Jacob has prayed to God, and he confronts God, and he walks away with a disability from this. And so I don't think the point of that is to say that God injures us, but that our interaction with God is not one that we should take lightly. And that's something to think about, right? What is the mystery of God? The darkness of God, not darkness in a negative sense, but the darkness in that element of God that we cannot handle, we cannot hold. As I said with verse 32, how it connected to the present readers, how does this story connect to us today? because the text is trying to do that. The text is saying this connects to you. I want to know what this does to Jacob, how this changes Jacob. After you read this, we don't have time to, but read 33, 1 through 17, where he meets Esau. He confronts Esau. He's with Esau. There's still some trickery there, though. So he kind of wiggles out. Esau's like, please come home with me. And he makes up kind of a nonsense excuse. And so we see Jacob as maturing, as humble, and yet Jacob is very much still has that trickery or just kind of mischievous side, if you don't like trickery. And I think that speaks to this as a coming of age story, but also the reality that we are always on a journey. Our faith is never perfected. Our faith is never reached. And then we kind of reach a static place, right? There's a dynamic element to it. And then lastly, just the question, who is the wrestler? Who is the adversary? Some Bible folks said, oh, it's from an earlier story where it was a river demon, or an earlier story where it was Esau. He confronted Esau, and that's why it's in the middle of the story. But the text as we have it does not say it's either of those for sure. And so as the text as we have it, it's either a man, it's either an angel or a messenger of God, or it's either God. Brueggemann says, I don't have a doubt this is God. I mean, he says, I have come face to face with God. Now, angels could speak on behalf of God and essentially speak as God. I don't know where I stand. I kind of like the idea of it being a man, an angel, and God, and we don't get to know which one for sure. We have to wrestle with the fact that this story is bigger than we want a nice, tidy narrative to be. And so, some days we're wrestling with a man, some days we're wrestling with God, and some days we're wrestling with an angel. And this story is all of those things seemingly at once. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say, Hosea, which was written down before this, in the 12th chapter, verse 4, says that Jacob wrestled with an angel, which is cool. And I love that self-referentiality, and also this element of the Genesis story, which was around for a long time, but wasn't written down most likely until the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and afterwards. A story in that is referenced in Hosea, which would have been written in around 722 when the northern kingdom was destroyed. So literally hundreds of years before. That's such a cool, interesting thing. And that story is saying it was an angel. So if that doesn't mix everything up, I don't know what does. Okay, what questions, thoughts, reflections do you have? Marcia?
I thought on your last one, the icon, and we didn't see those all that closely, but it seemed like there was a blue circle up at the top, and it seemed to me that was maybe, see there, yeah, that was maybe God. It looks like it's got a person in it watching the whole thing, and I had never thought about that, but I was wondering whether that was what he was saying. And the angel, of course, has the two fingers up, which would be the blessing.
Right.
Isn't that how in the Eastern Church they use the two fingers for the blessing?
Yeah, and it also is ICXE, which is Jesus Christ.
Right.
ICXE is the first and last of Jesus and Christ.
So I'm sure if we studied that one for a long time, but it seems like that artist was seeing it as the messenger with God looking on and basically approving it, I guess, as it went by. One other thing that I noticed from I've been reading like 4 versions and the notes for whatever our readings are. And one of my versions in the notes said that they thought Jacob was 97 years old at the time, which makes the little boy portrayal particularly amusing. But Jacob isn't the mama's boy that you might have thought about in the early parts of the story. He moves that huge stone. He wrestles to a draw with an angel at least, maybe, and maybe God himself. So it's changed. This study has changed my picture of Jacob.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to see, a 97-year-old wrestling with God.
Yeah, amusing.
Sybil Hole.
After reading this passage for years and wondering about Jacob wrestling, it struck me that the reason that he hangs on and demands a blessing was, I like what you said, it's a coming of age, it's a maturing for him, and he knows that he stole his blessing. He stole his brother's blessing from his father, and he is coming to grips with that. And so he holds on and he says, bless me for who I am, bless Jacob. And I think that is pivotal in his becoming Israel. I think he had to come to grips with that and say, this is mine now. This is not something I've stolen from somebody else. God has blessed me.
That's extremely insightful, and I hadn't made that connection, and I haven't read that elsewhere. That's really thoughtful. Yeah, it's like he's stolen the blessing, and now he's getting a blessing, and that ties into that element of face and before, right? It's his face, and God can see his face, whereas before Isaac couldn't. Yeah, that's really insightful, Sybil. Thanks for sharing that. And that's like I was saying, all of these Jacob narratives keep referring back to each other. I was just going to say real quick, Bill, there's a level of complexity to these stories that we so often don't get because they're so familiar and they're so quick, but there's so much in them. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, to build on that, Robert Adler in his commentary, made an observation that was new to me, but when I read it, it made sense. If I may just briefly read a quote and then comment on it briefly. He describes Jacob as one whose life is entangled in moral ambiguities. We've talked about that. He then says, whereas Abraham is invariably called Abraham once the name is changed from Abram, instead, the narrative continues to refer, in this case, to Jacob, in most instances as Jacob. Thus, Israel does not really replace his name, but becomes a synonym for it, a practice reflected in the parallelism of biblical poetry, where Jacob is always used in the first half of the line and Israel, the poetic variation in the second half. Now, what I make of that is building on your thing of the tension but inseparability of the sacred and the human. And you think both names have to do with conflict. Jacob means grasping, and Israel means either God wrestles with you or you wrestle with God. And I may be making too much of it, but the Jacob Israel to me could be understood as a reminder, you're still a human being, you're still that grasper, but you're more than that. You represent a whole nation. And I know as a pastor, we often would talk among ourselves of it matters how we act as pastors, because we're not just a human being, we're perceived as a representative of God, not better than anybody else, that's not my point. But for example, when a minister fails morally, it doesn't just affect that minister or the minister's family, but the congregation and others. And that's a negative illustration, but I see that point from Alter re-emphasizing what you're saying and building on what Sybil said. And I think that's true for all of us. I am still Bill Hall, but by God's grace, I may be more than that or represent more than that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about Jacob and Israel, and the way that's referenced in other passages. It reminds me too of David. We have like David, the person, the king, and also David as this kind of figurehead, and also almost a foreshadowing of Christ and the connection that's made in the genealogy. And so you have David kind of representing these two different people. And I always think of all the patriarchs, Jacob and David are the most similar, because Joseph is the goody two shoes, and Abraham's just kind of the blameless, upright, and moral, guy, like a 1950s sitcom father or something like that, and Isaac is just this kind of weird guy we don't know much about. Thanks. Who else has Aaron?
Your question, how does it connect to us today? We actually studied this chapter and this story in Today when I was there in July. And so we did spend 3 hours on this discussion, but it was such a great discussion, and the brother who was leading it had so many insights. But the way he connected this to today, he said, and I pulled my notes out when I was from my journal, but he said that Jacob needed solitude to answer the question, who are you? So similar to what you were saying, Bill, who is Jacob? Who are we? And so Jacob needed solitude to answer that question. And the brother said in his teaching to us that there are some spiritual journeys that we can only take when we are alone. Being alone takes courage. We, in today's world, prefer noise. We prefer to be connected. And he said, silence is necessary to reach maturity. It is through silence that we recognize our gifts and limitations. And the brother continued to explain, we talked about that a lot during this lesson. But then he also says later in it, he was talking about how Jacob was wrestling, and it's similar to how we today are wrestling with so many things. But he says Jacob was wrestling to break from egocentricity and being a narcissist, his guilt for the stolen blessing, and to understand that the blessing is from God. And it was the first time I think that I had really studied this chapter in that much detail. I think I have like 15 pages of notes from it, but those are just some of the ways I think that they were in Today. They were trying to help us see that how relevant this story is to our struggles today, and how important it is for us to have those moments of solitude to answer the question to God, who am I, so that we can have that kind of maturity ourselves.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That reminds me of Thomas Merton in his book No Man is an Island makes a distinction between loneliness and solitude. And solitude, we are always connected to someone else, whether it's the community around us or to God, and it is with purpose. And loneliness is depression or sadness, being cut off from others. And one of those is healthy, and one of those is oftentimes unhealthy. And the need for solitude in our lives, like you were pointing out, especially in a day when we are bombarded with noise and just stuff. Thanks for sharing that.
Will?
Yes.
Sometimes that story, a story within a story is sometimes called an embedded narrative. I'm not sure if that's a term you were looking for. The thing that strikes me about this story is the sentence where he says that when day is breaking, the angel appears to concede or break off the encounter. And I'm just wondering what the significance of the angel not wanting to be in the light, or whatever the idea behind that is.
You're saying, why doesn't the angel want to be seen in the light?
Why does he break it? Why does he break it off when the day is breaking? Why does he want to?
So I don't have like a specific answer I can stand behind, but one of the most common ones given is that this is God, and God doesn't want to be seen fully. And so when the light of day would come, God's face would be fully revealed. I honestly, I don't have anything other than that, but that's just one of the explanations I've heard. I do think it signals to the fact that this isn't a regular adversary or intruder. There's something wholly transcendent about this person. And there's this element of they need to get going before other people can see them, whether that's Jacob seeing the face of God or it's an angel that doesn't want to be seen by the rest of the camp.
Hey, Will.
Yes.
I just wanted to read to you the commentary in my study Bible, which kind of goes back to who is he wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the man wrestled, it says the sight Peniel or face of God given by Jacob and the commentary given by Hosea in 12:4, which you'd already talked about, identifies this man with whom Jacob wrestled as the angel of the Lord, who is also identified as God, a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's kind of going back to exactly what you said before, that Hosea referenced this as God and an angel of God, that it could be both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think we so often want to treat the scriptures as like a history, and so that they have to be static and they have to be factual, and they have to be where we can contain them, we can grasp them. And these are religious stories, they're not history. And that's not to say there's not historical elements. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is they're much bigger than history. And so they speak volumes, right? They speak beyond themselves over and over again. That's why they're scripture, because they can continue to reveal to us. And so I just think that's the beauty of this, is that angel, that man, that if it's God, whoever it is, it's all of those things. And it's not all of those things. And it just keeps speaking. And as Christians, we can read into this story a prefiguration of Christ in many ways. There's I think he was 8th century Orthodox writer named Maximus the Confessor. And he had this beautiful saying that, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, they weren't prefiguring Christ, but rather when Christ came into the world, Christ changed those scriptures. And so for him, there was an actual affecting of the past by Christ. And I think that's such a powerful way to think of it. It's not like we think of it as like prophetic and they're foretelling Christ. It's more so that Christ is such a powerful, time transcending thing, revelation, whatever you want to call it, that it affects everything that's come before it, and it will affect everything that comes after it. And so you have that very divine element of who Christ is. Anyone else have any thoughts or reflections on this passage? Pam.
Can you hear me yet? Okay.
I can hear you now. Oh,
right here. Okay, I got it. Basically, I really love what you've done, because it's such a wonderful humanistic, having to me, the history of art tied in with the spiritual. And I didn't know if you could even send us the PowerPoint of those replications, and how important you see this involving, just so many different groups and so global. And I guess the thing, I keep thinking of the book, The Red Tent, that I read, and in her description, which is supposedly fictional, she has the angel as just a dark figure who's absolutely beating Jacob up, and not just the hip being broken, but he just lies there, and he's on an island, sort of in a swampy area, and he's there by himself afterwards, and one of his sons has to come get him to try and get him back to the flock. So the idea is, I like that idea that suffering really requires, suffering is a big issue, and the journey we're on, it's not smooth. I really like that idea too.
Yeah, and I think the point of this isn't like to glorify suffering or to give suffering meaning in itself, but rather that's the way life is. You suffer. I mean, I don't think anyone's on this that hasn't suffered in some form or fashion, whether that's physically or emotionally or mentally or spiritually. And the point being is that the suffering comes, and through the suffering, there is an opportunity to be confronted with God or to make meaning out of the suffering. And so, you know, Jacob could have gotten his butt kicked by some random person and gone home. And yet what we see from this is there is a whole breadth and depth of meaning and importance to this whole story, and it continues outward, right? It's saturated with meaning, and that meaning is affecting us thousands of years later. And I just think that's such an important thing. We are connected intimately to these stories in ways we know and we don't know, and they speak to us and they give us meaning in our own encounters with God. And oftentimes our encounters with God are during times of suffering, our deepest encounters, I should say.
And I like,
yes, go ahead.
it made me think of the pebble and the circles from the pebble getting larger and larger as you sort of explained that.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor or analogy. Another one that comes to mind, and some of y'all might have heard me reference this, but a friend of mine and a man who served as my spiritual director for a time, he's an older Jesuit, and I asked him one time, because I've gone through certain health issues, and I asked him, I said, why do I always feel God when at the most? Why am I most aware of God's presence when I feel the worst? When I feel like just complete, you know, fill in the blank. And he said it's because you are most aware of God in those moments. All the trivialities have been pushed aside. And the way I think about it is, if we go out into a cold storm and we cover ourselves up with tons and tons and tons of clothing, like you put on a shirt, a sweatshirt, a jacket, and then a big jacket, you're going to feel the cold in a way that is dampened, right? You're not going to feel it. Now, if you go out into the cold naked, or you just have shorts and shirts on, you're going to feel that cold in a way that's evident and unavoidable. And I think that's what suffering does in a way, is suffering withdraws all the clothing that's separating us from the coldness or from God. And so it's not that the suffering has a purpose or is meaningful in and of itself, but it kind of draws us away from all of the kind of noise and chatter that would normally separate us from being thoughtful of God. It's like, why do we go on retreats, right? We go on retreats to escape emails, and temporarily our family life, our job, to become closer to God. It's not that our family life is bad or that our job is bad, but it's that, you know, some moments entail that we need to be intentional about pulling that away. And I think that's one of the main messages of this story too, is that Jacob is confronted by God. Instead of running away, and it's a scary moment, right? It's a stranger in the dark. Jacob latches on. And I think that's a big message for us, is when God confronts us to hold on tight. Because I've had moments when I've been personally confronted with God and I run away because it's overwhelming and it's scary. But there's blessings to be had if you hold on. Anything else before we go, Marcia?
Don't forget that he left his family's house in the dark, and he's going back to meet Esau in the day.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. And I would advise all of y'all when we sign off to go read the first 17 verses of chapter 33, because it's intimately tied to this story. I would have read it if it wasn't for our time, but it is this story. It's not the 33rd chapter. It is this story. I think the word I was looking for was intercalation. That just popped up in my head. Maybe not. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, let's close with our benediction. Let us go from this place, remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place, proclaiming Jacob's words, surely the Lord is in this place. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you in a week, if not before.
Thanks.
I'll send out the slideshow too.
Thank you.